Hey there, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 54. For our first question today, Fricky from South Africa asks, can you please talk a bit about Graves' disease and the impact of a rogue thyroid on the system, particularly the impact of T4 levels?
All right, Graves' disease. Graves' disease is an autoimmune attack on your thyroid gland. Thyroid gland, we all know we have thyroid glands, and hardly anyone bothers to find out what it does. Thyroid hormone, very important for brain development. In an adult, what it's about is metabolism. Thyroid hormone, coming from your thyroid gland, boosts up metabolism. Metabolism, the rate at which your body is doing business. If you really want to get into the underbrush here, metabolism consists of two things: anabolism, the rate at which you are making stuff, and catabolism, the rate at which you are breaking it down. So what thyroid hormone does is increases the volume of making stuff and breaking it down, and your heart's beating faster, and your body temperature goes up with thyroid hormone, and your digestive tract digests faster, and it increases metabolism. So that's what thyroid hormones do to your body. Technically, there's two different types of thyroid hormones. One is a precursor for the other, T3, T4, but for our purposes here, it's just going to be thyroid hormone as a collective category. So, what happens if something goes wrong? Dramatic foreshadowing here, so that your thyroid hormone levels get way too high. And what you get is a typical profile. People lose a lot of weight because their metabolism is just burning everything off. They become very heat intolerant because their body's temperature is gone. They get the runs because their digestive tract is moving way too fast. They get muscle weakness, and probably most distinctively, your eyes bulge out, which is one of the most characteristic signs of Graves' disease. Okay, so the question, of course, becomes what's going on in Graves' disease, which results in elevated levels of thyroid hormone. And what we have here is a not so classic autoimmune disease. Immunity, the job of your immune system is to constantly do surveillance throughout your body and spot things that are self, that are you, and things that are not self, and then coordinate an immune attack on the not self stuff. Bacteria, viruses, all sorts of pathogens. Good. So that being the immune system specialty, um, okay, that being the immune system specialty, we've got every now and then it makes a terrible mistake. It mistakes a part of your body for being something invasive and attacks it. Type 1 diabetes, it attacks a cell type in your pancreas. Multiple sclerosis, it attacks a constituent type of cell, myelin, that wraps around your neurons. Graves' disease, what you have in most of these autoimmune diseases is there seems to be some pathogen, some bacteria that just by chance has a protein that is structurally similar to a protein that's a you protein, that's a me. This should be here. This is normal. And normally the immune system is capable of spotting a mistake when accidentally it has formed an antibody that will both attack this protein from this bacteria, but then mistakenly attack the very similarly shaped protein in you. It's usually good at that for a bunch of reasons. Some people are more prone genetically towards the immune system messing up and deciding that it is now going to attack a particular protein that's part of you, that's a self protein. And this is what happens in Graves' disease. There's a bacteria which there's still some uncertainty about it, but which seems to be the one which triggers it by having too much similarity to a protein in your thyroid gland. So, autoimmune attack in your thyroid gland. Turns out there's two diseases where that happens. One of them is your normal run-of-the-mill autoimmune disease, something called Hashimoto's thyroiditis. You develop antibodies, autoantibodies that attack your thyroid gland and destroy it, which is what your immune system is hopefully doing to bacteria and viruses and parasites. And now, because of this mistake, it destroys your thyroid gland. And what does Hashimoto's disease involve? Thyroid hormone levels that are way too low, close to zero in some cases. And what you see is a whole profile of disease symptoms that are exactly the opposite of elevated thyroid hormone levels. Which brings us back to Graves' disease. You've developed autoantibodies that attack a different protein in your thyroid. And what is it we just heard? What happens when you have an autoimmune attack on one of your organs? It attacks it, it kills the cells in there, it destroys it. Hashimoto's destroying your thyroid gland. But here in Graves, something very atypical is happening. In an autoimmune disease, you have what is called an activating autoantibody. When the antibodies are going to your thyroid gland rather than just being concerned with that hypothetical bacteria. In this case, what it does is it overactivates your thyroid gland. Rather than destroying it, thyroid hormone levels crash to the floor, you begin to hypersecrete thyroid hormones, massively elevated levels. And that's the profile you see with Graves' disease. Weight loss, heat intolerance, the runs, tremors, muscle weaknesses, and bulging eyes. Um, and there's a bunch of treatments for Graves. One is you can try to selectively get out the rogue antibody, something called plasmapheresis, or you could be unsubtle and just throw in a huge immunosuppressive drug like corticosteroids that will suppress your whole immune system. So your immune system can't attack your thyroid anymore. And meanwhile, the rest of your immune system can't do its usual thing, lots and lots of side effects. Or what's often done is the thyroid is surgically removed and you take replacement hormone levels of thyroid hormone. Okay, so that's terrific. So we've got this hormone that's all about the rate at which your gut is peristalting and your heart rate and all. But then behavior comes into it because thyroid hormone gets into the brain where there's a bunch of classes of thyroid hormone receptors scattered all over the brain. And what happens behaviorally when somebody's got elevated thyroid hormone levels, as in Graves' disease, you begin to see restlessness, anxiety, irritability, emotional lability. This is what you see very often, typically going along with Graves' disease. And in a small subset of individuals where things really go in the unlucky direction with Graves' disease, that irritability, that emotional lability, that restlessness all over the place is easily mistaken for one of two different psychiatric disorders. One is you appear to be having a psychosis, and there's a thyroid psychosis with some fancy name named for the dead white male 19th century guy who first sort of noted this happening. Or you can be diagnosed with mania, with manic depression, with bipolar disorder. And it turns out about 5% of the cases of people diagnosed with bipolar disorder, when you look closely and snuffle around there and look, what you see is instead it's an undiagnosed case of Graves' disease. And get the thyroid hormone levels down, treat the Graves appropriately, and that's usually successful. And the symptoms of the mania, the bipolar disorder, or of the psychosis disappear at that point. Okay, so that's great. That's interesting about thyroid hormone, Graves' disease, your immune system. What's the bigger take home message here? Thyroid hormone, for thousands of years, when you take an endocrinology class and you have any interest whatsoever in the brain and behavior, you immediately space out when they're going over thyroid hormone because what's it doing? It has to do with the metabolic rate of your liver making proteins and breaking them down, and the rate at which your intestines are squeezing and pushing stuff and wonder, and like all this boring plumbing stuff going on there. But aha, this boring peripheral metabolic hormone of no interest to anyone who cares about the brain and behavior, it's getting in the brain And it could affect your behavior to a point where you appear to have a psychiatric disorder that you don't actually have. Easy take home message. Ooh, psychiatry has to involve looking at hormone levels, looking at what's going on in your liver. You can't make sense of a brain outside the context of the body in which it is setting. Broader picture, endless talking of your body talking to your brain talking to your body, unseparable false dichotomies all over the place, tempted there between mind and brain and body, and they're all inseparable. And the behavioral effects of Graves' disease is a great demonstration of that.
Okay, now Max from Wisconsin says, I was recently diagnosed as bipolar and prescribed an anticonvulsant. What is the science behind how these medications work to treat bipolar disorder?
Well, Max, this forms a very convenient bridge to the previous question, where one of the punchlines was Graves' disease could be mistaken for bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder, also harking back a number of episodes to when we went over its broad features. Okay, the mania, bipolar, manic depression, the mania that dominates. What's it look like? The person has minimal need for sleep for days on end, enormous amounts of energy, rapid pressured speech, grandiose ideas, terrible judgment, often catastrophically terrible judgment, when some of the grandiose, exciting ideas don't pan out, often a descent into belligerence, and most definedly, a cycle of going into a manic phase with that profile and then crashing into periods of depression back and forth there, that being very characteristic of it. Now, the standard treatment for the mania and bipolar for about a century now has been with the drug lithium. And that's got a very interesting history of how it was accidentally discovered that this was helpful for mania, and it's very interesting. And what's also very interesting is people have known next to nothing about what lithium does therapeutically for bipolar disorder. I think talked about in a previous episode some of the first hints coming in. People during manic periods, bipolar at all points, in fact, have wild disruptions of their daily circadian rhythms, and lithium seems to interact with some clock genes in the brain to stabilize those. Okay, so that's been the standard treatment, lithium. In recent decades, an additional class of treatments have come in with a class of drugs called mood stabilizers. And if your defining symptoms involve being labile emotionally all over the place, something that stabilizes your mood is a good thing. And since mania is involved hyperactivity, enormous energy expenditure, all of that. What you want is a mood stabilizer, is something to bring you down and calm you. So, how do you calm the nervous system? Broadly, there's two different strategies. You can decrease the excitatory signaling in the brain, or you can increase the inhibitory. And they both accomplish the same. And there's two classes of these mood stabilizing drugs used for bipolar. One of them is a drug called lamotrigine. And what that does is that decreases the excitation. The other, the flip side of it, drug called valproic acid, and that increases the inhibitory tone. Neurotransmitter fans here will be able to guess that what it does is boost up signaling of GABA, the very inhibitory neurotransmitter. Okay, so that's great, both thrown in there, and they stabilize your mood, and that's terrific. And what a great advance in psychiatric psychopharmacotherapeutics. How did people discover this stuff? And it turned out that these mood stabilizer drugs had been used for years in a different realm of medicine, which is another domain, a very, very qualitatively different domain of your brain being too excited, someone with a seizure disorder. What are seizures? Characteristic is when you are having an epileptic seizure, not only are neurons in a particular characteristic part of your brain firing way too fast, but firing in synchrony as well, waves of excitation. And it turns out all sorts of routes of injury where neurons will wind up exciting each other. So one gets excited and it gets and you get these synchronized waves. And what the treatment has been, some of the most effective medications have been mood stabilizers, except in that case, they're called anticonvulsants. And it's doing the exact same logic, how to control someone who has repeated seizures, who needs medication, decrease the excitability in their nervous system by way of these drugs like lamotrigine, or increase the inhibitory tone with valproic acid, and the same exact logic. Where's the difference come in? The scale, the typical dosage when you were taking these mood stabilizers, not to stabilize your mania, but instead as an anticonvulsant, 5 times, 10 times the dose that you were taking for controlling mania. So that leads to two questions at the end here. The first one is, ooh, so is the mania of manic depression, is mania like a little mini version of epilepsy? No, it's completely different part of the brain. It's a completely different pathway towards hyperexcitation. It's not a mini seizure. Totally different quality to it. The second question is, well, that's weird. You have an epileptic seizure, for example, that starts in this part of your brain, the temporal lobe, which is where a lot of them do. And you've got mania, which seems to have something to do with some dopamine pathways and circadian clocks. These are two totally different parts of the brain, totally different function. And you throw in the same drug and it's helpful with both. Well, what we see is you throw them in at appropriate concentrations, but nonetheless, they're helpful with both. That seems weird. And what we have, rather than being weird, is the problem of you have a neurotransmitter problem in one particular part of your brain where this particular neurotransmitter has something to do with how fast your pancreas makes insulin. Whereas in this part of the brain, the same exact neurotransmitter has something to do with remembering the name of your kindergarten teacher and different functions in different places. And in mania, there's a neurotransmitter problem of hyperexcitation, say in this spot, whereas in a seizure disorder, it's in some other spot there. Whoa, how do you fix things up in these two different places? How do you direct it to one place or the other? You don't. You take a drug, you put it in your mouth, you put it in your gut, it gets into your bloodstream, it gets all over the brain, and thus it is affecting that neurotransmitter system all over the brain. And some of the time, it will be doing things to mess up function in other parts of the brain while it's fixing up this problem. What have we just defined? Those are side effects in the brain from drugs here. So bipolar disorder is not some sort of mini epilepsy. Epilepsy is not bipolar disorder that's magnified through the roof. Different parts of the brain, different parts of processes. The commonality, though, is not only this excess of excitation, but a similar neurochemical underpinning of how that happens, and thus the serendipity of being able to use the same drugs for these two very different disorders.
Finally, Sam from Vancouver says, an orca mother was recently observed carrying the corpse of her stillborn calf in Puget Sound. A few years ago, the same orca gave birth to another stillborn calf and carried the corpse for 17 days, keeping it afloat and away from predators. Should we understand this as grief? Which other animals express grief of the death of family members and friends? Do these creatures grieve the same way as humans do?
Well, first, hi, Sam. It was nice to see your name pop up. But orcas, orcas are fierce ocean predators. They take on all sorts of things. Individual orcas will kill great white sharks, all sorts of cooperative hunting techniques they do. They can figure out how to flap the water enough to make a gigantic wave to wash off some seal that's trying to get away from them on an ice floe. The same individual orca who was taking out great white sharks had this additionally interesting behavior of ripping open their stomach afterward and pulling out their liver and eating only their liver and leaving the rest of the carcass there for the fishies down there. So orcas are fierce, interesting predators. They're weird, interesting beasts, and they've been in the news in a number of ways in recent years. First off, this teenage hoodlum gang of male adolescent orcas in the Straits of Gibraltar have been attacking boats there for a number of years now, ramming them, yachts, to the point of capsizing them, sinking them. This has been a major problem there in the yachting lanes. And I don't know if this is some sort of blow against the oligarchy and their yachts on the parts of the orcas, but if so, we welcome it. But the best interpretation is that these are basically some well-fed, bored adolescent orcas who kind of decide it's fun to do this to whatever these weird things are. Next in our weird category of orca behaviors, harking back to a couple of weeks back, talking about fashion statements in other species and talking about that strange example of that chimp who, for whatever mysterious reason, liked to put a blade of grass in her ear each morning and walked around with it sticking out. And soon everybody in the group was doing that. There's been an equivalent cultural tradition observed in some groups of orcas, and it was this particular pod up by the Pacific Northwest, which in 1980 started a behavior which is now termed dead fish hats. The orca comes underneath a fish it has just killed, and as a show that this is something special, it is just killed and refrained from eating, and comes up underneath the dead fish and just swims around with this dead salmon draped across there like a hat. And what was first seen in the 1980s was the pattern familiar from that other one on sort of non-human fashion, conformity, and such. This was a tradition that spread throughout this orca pod, and it spread to neighboring pods. And who knows why? There are all sorts of speculations. Orcas will sometimes share a fish that they kill. They will, for example, a mama orca will bite the fish in half and leave the other half for her youngin, but there was no suggestion this was going on. And the best that science can do is that for some reason orcas around there decided they wanted to have dead fish hats, and maybe it increased their reproductive success, or maybe they just like the smell of dead fish. But, we all do stuff like that. And the lore was soon afterward, in the early 80s, the dead fish hat craze died out. Um, the orcas stopped doing that because it was lame and passe. And reports are in the last few months that there is an orca now in the Pacific Northwest off the coast there who's doing dead fish hat behavior. And the questions are, of course, are we seeing a revitalization of some long disdained fashion there? Or orcas now doing the equivalent of dancing on water beds and cranberry bell bottoms and such? Is this coming back? It's not clear if this is a new fashion wave coming through. The same phenomenon has not been seen as back then recently of it spreading among the rest of the orcas. And there's been sporadic reports of dead fish hattery among orcas over the years. It's some weird thing that's been like going on with orcas for quite some time. They also apparently do this odd behavior where they kind of drape themselves in seaweed and drop it from the surface. And okay, so they do playful stuff. And one telltale sign of that with the dead fish fashion is it tends to be during the salmon migration period where they are gorged. They're not hungry, and thus there's dead fish to put on your head. And why not? Because there's a surplus. All of this brings us to the much more uh, dark moving issue brought up by Sam, which is something else that orcas are observed to do, takes us into this whole field of comparative thanatology. Thanatology, the study of the dead and our interactions with the dead. Comparative thanatology, how other species interact with their dead. And the example seen here is this female orca in Puget Sound who was found to be carrying her dead calf, her calf that was about a month old. This was back in January, draped across her bow and carried it around and carried it for days, carried it. It would come off. She would go down underneath and come back up again and bring it up to the surface and keep it with her. And this was remarkable. And what was even more remarkable was this same female had lost a calf about 7 years ago and had done the exact same thing with her dead calf then. She carried it, maintained it for 17 days, covered more than 1,000 miles of migration, balancing her dead calf across her bow there. Bow, whatever whales have in their foreheads there. And this is extraordinary. This is extraordinary, and it's not unique. And you see stuff like this. You see dolphins will carry around their dead infant. That's been seen in half a dozen different dolphin species from all over the world. One group has identified a distinctive vocalization that a female dolphin will make when she has her dead calf and give a vocalization that seems to be some sort of come here, can I have a shoulder to lean on sort of vocalization, because soon typically her close female associates show up on either side of her. And this is seen with this orca as well, two female orcas swimming alongside her. So this is a pattern that's popped up in a lot of these cases. Now, where comparative thanatology has also gone over the years is outside of marine mammals. And of course, the most amazing examples, by my money, has been with non-human primates, where in lots of different primate species, you see essentially the same behavior. A chimp mother loses her infant, a baboon mother, the infant dies, and what you will often see is the female will now hold on to the infant, the dead infant. Maybe she doesn't understand the infant is dead and or she's trying to revive it or something. But what you see there is something as extraordinary as with this orca that chimps, baboon mothers will carry around their dead infant for days and weeks to the point where the corpse is necrotic before they finally put it down. This is not them having trouble trying to figure out if their child is sleeping or dead. This is something completely different. And you see a whole bunch of chimp behavior, various macaque monkeys, baboons, my beloveds, around the dead. In some cases, they will stay by the body of a dead individual, sometimes for days, guarding it. In some cases, a group will gather there around it. In other cases, they will avoid the spot where the individual died if they were predated, if the body is eventually carried off by a hyena or something. And all sorts of distinctive behaviors go on that you don't normally see. So you look at something like this, and of course, you got to ask a few different versions of the same question, what's going on here? Big picture version of it. So, how did this comparative thanatological behavior evolve in all these different species? What's the Darwinian advantage of whales and dolphins and other cetaceans as well, and primates and other species, terrestrial mammals, um, bringing with them their dead offspring? And the like totally unmoving idea that's been floating around for years is, well, every now and then your infant hasn't actually died. They're just in a coma from something or other. And if you just abandon them, the hyenas will get them that night while they're still in a coma. So carry them around because 3 days from now, they may wake up again and you have just saved your genetic investment in your offspring and enhanced your reproductive success. And look how adaptive that is. And that's why animals in all sorts of unlikely places carry around their dead infants just in case they're not dead. There's a long human tradition of this, which is before the invention of high-tech sort of medical instruments like the stethoscope. It was, in fact, very hard to tell if somebody was in a coma or if they were dead, if they were taking 2 breaths a minute, if their heartbeat was faint and you can barely detect it because you didn't have a stethoscope. And there were all sorts of cultural adaptations done during that period of be careful, don't assume they're dead. They may actually be comatose for a while here. And for example, you will have a ceremony. You will have a whole bunch of people sitting around the coffin for days. And this was in the UK during 18th century, earlier as well, sitting around just in case the person wakes up. You hold a wake, which was to make sure you hadn't mistaken this comatose person for being dead. There was even something called a patent coffin that was patented early 18th century, late whatever, where the coffin, and you would keep it there for a few days, and built into it from the inside was a little bell that you could ring in case you woke up in there and you weren't dead. This was like a known issue of like it could sometimes be difficult to tell the difference between the living and the dead without some like techniques for knowing what's going on inside. And chimps and dolphins and baboons are certainly not going to have come up with stethoscopes. So, whoa, carry your infant around because they may just be in a coma and they'll wake up in a couple of days. Carry your infant around for weeks until it's a necrotic leftover of skeleton and mummified skin. I think that one sort of pushes one's credulity to think that that is a selective force that has happened with that. So, in other words, why do they do this? What's the evolutionary advantage? No obvious advantage. Why do they do this? What are they thinking? And cognitive ethologists have done a lot of work trying to understand what animals understand about the difference between something that is animate, something that used to be animate and isn't anymore, something that never was animate. And you see all sorts of non-human primate behaviors indicating interests in this and trying to make sense of this. And you will see, for example, chimps have been observed when finding a dead bush buck or something. They will sit around it, they will groom it, they will examine it, they will push it to try to see if it will get up and eventually give up on it, knowing this is something that's usually animate, but it's not now. And at some point, either you get bored or hungry or conclude that this used to be animate, but not anymore, some sort of permanent state. You see examples like that. What that, of course, pulls you irresistibly to, like moths to the flame, is to start with stuff like, so do other species understand death? Do they understand the inevitability of mortality? Are they going to rage against the dying of the lights? And like, there's no way to find out. And it seems highly unlikely, but nonetheless, all sorts of species are oriented to things that are animate, obviously, and things that used to be animate. And there's even evidence that they can do some adaptive sort of things with things that used to be animate. Observed among chimps, when you have a chimp who is predated by a leopard, this was a population in West Africa and the Ivory Coast. When you have a chimp who, for example, is predated by a leopard and the remnants of the body are there, everyone gathers around, everyone investigates. In contrast, if you have a chimp who dies of some sort of wasting illness, everybody avoids the corpse. What's up with that? You want to make an adaptive just so story. There's a difference between being abruptly killed by a predator and abruptly killed by an infectious disease? Do they not only understand death, but do they understand community transmission rates and things? Zero, but this is what is observed. But the final, why do we do this question is the one that gets to the heart of what Sam brought up, which is not what's the adaptive value of this behavior and what's the cognitive underpinnings. What are they feeling? Are they feeling grief? And there's a certain knee jerk, by now mostly dated, sort of school of ethology that would say that this is grief-like behavior. And when you look at a whale carrying her dead calf for weeks, for 1,000 miles of migration, when you look at a female baboon who forgoes efficient foraging for days on end because she's using one of her two arms to hold this dead infant there, when you were looking at that, you were seeing something emotionally strong is happening. When you were seeing dolphins and orcas giving a distinctive, in effect, alarm vocalization calling for support that is distinctive to when they have their dead calf there, it is very hard not to decide you are seeing grief because you are seeing the same symptoms of it during a period like that. For example, chimps, when they lose a close friend, sibling, family member, such, they will stop foraging. They will stop eating. They will stop socializing. They will just sit there. They will show some of the classic vegetative bodily symptoms of major depression. And as we've talked about in previous episodes, when you can look under the hood at what's going on in the body of a non-human primate at times like that, it's the same neurobiology of us when we are filled with grief. Okay, so it sure looks like it, but damn, don't we have any science to prove it? Here's one fascinating study. This was work carried out by a pair of superb primatologists at University of Pennsylvania, Dorothy Cheney, who unfortunately is no longer alive, and Robert Seyfarth. The two of them were studying various non-human primates in Africa for decades. And this was a study they had with baboons, Chacma baboons, is a different species than I study. And what they looked at was something that warmed my heart, which was the stress physiology of these animals. Rather than being able to dart and anesthetize these baboons and take their blood, which was what my song and dance was they would collect fecal samples and you could extract hormone breakdown products from there and be able to get a sense of what the hormone levels were like in the bloodstream. And this has caused this whole cottage industry of people who like track down fecal samples from some primate and measure fecal levels of cortisol, stress hormone, glucocorticoids. And what they showed in this study was in this population with years of data, what they saw was if a female lost a family member, died, what you would see is over the subsequent weeks, her levels of cortisol, of glucocorticoids, would rise and the fecal samples would rise in the bloodstream. She was having a sustained stress response. And the other thing that you would see is a shift in behavior that during those times, during that period, she would sit in closer contact to her relatives and friends. And friends is not an anthropomorphized term here. It is absolutely legit for other primates besides us. They would sit in closer contact, spend more time grooming with more close affiliated part. The behavior changed, and the more of that grooming, the faster the glucocorticoid levels went back to baseline. And if you need to like measure steroid hormones in some baboon scat to be convinced that something stressful and sad was going on, which evoked support evoking behaviors, somebody come and groom me, somebody let me groom them, and especially if it's someone whose face is very familiar and comforting. And if you see stuff like that, okay, you need to go prove with steroid hormone levels that you were seeing grief there. If that's not grief, then we're arguing about definitions here. It's not mourning, which is referring to ritualized expressions of grief that have cultural connotations and are carried out by multiple people and sitting around waiting for your dead whoever to perhaps wake up, a mourning ceremony. But this sure looks like grief. And if you were going to argue that this is not extreme emotional distress in our close relatives, I would say you are missing the affective boat as to what's going on in both them and us.
And that's it for episode 54. Keep submitting questions at the forum found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.